It's because our temperature on our planet, it typically drops as you go away from the surface. And that's true on Venus as well. So away from the surface, up at about 50 kilometers above Venus's surface, the temperature is actually just right for life. And the pressure there as well, it matters less, but the pressure and temperature are just like we have right here on Earth, right in the room that you're in now. And so the thought is that there could be life living in the clouds of Venus. And that's kind of motivated by here on Earth, we have an aerial biosphere.
Professor Seager works on space missions for planetary discovery and exploration, and she's also the Deputy Science Director of the MIT-led NASA Explorer-class mission TESS. She was the PI of the MIT JPL CubeSat Asteria, is a lead of the Starshade Rendezvous mission, and most recently is leading a mission concept study to find signs of life or life itself in the Venusian atmosphere. Among other accolades, Professor Seager is a member of the US National Academy of Sciences, a MacArthur Fellow, a recipient of the Sackler Prize in the Physical Sciences, and has asteroid 9729 named in her honor. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sara Seager.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to share my screen, and if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. And some of them I'll answer during, and the rest we'll answer at the end. So I'm here to talk to you about the search for life beyond Earth, Venus. I'm going to start talking about exoplanets, then I'll get into Venus. But right at the outset, I want to say that in this field of research, what we say is like the line between what is considered crazy research and what is considered mainstream is constantly shifting. And for Venus itself, actually, people have speculated about life on it, starting with Carl Sagan over half a century ago. It's certainly crazy back then, and I think it's still kind of crazy now. But let me get started and see where this takes us. So a few billion years ago, cyanobacteria, this sort of humble bacteria, did something incredible and discovered how to harness sunlight to extract energy. That's photosynthesis, and in the process gave off oxygen gas, which initially poisoned everything around it, but eventually oxygen filled our atmosphere. So, to 20% by volume. So if there's an intelligent aliens out there, not too far away, with the kind of telescopes we're trying to build, and they look back at Earth and see oxygen, they'll wonder what's up, because oxygen's a highly reactive gas. They might even be able to infer that there's life here. So actually, an astronomer nearly 100 years ago recognized that oxygen could be a sign of life on another world. And ever since then, and really kind of rapidly accelerating now, where really lots of people around the world are trying to figure out what and how to look for. So I'm going to give you an introduction about mostly how I got on to working on Venus. Then I'll tell you about this so-called big discovery on Venus, and then what's next. So I should say that just to make sure we're all on the same page, every star in the sky is the sun. And so our sun has planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, etc. It makes sense that other stars have planets also, and they do. And we know of thousands of planets. Here at MIT, we're finding 100 new planet candidates every month. And like a good fraction of those turn out to be real planets. So they're literally everywhere, just waiting to be found. The way we find planets today is, the main way we find planets is, do you see the cartoon with the planet going in front of the star? That's an artist's conception, because we don't spatially resolve any star other than our sun quite like that. On the bottom, you can see what we do see. We measure the brightness of a star as a function of time. That would be like our telescopes and our space missions. It would be like you pointing your phone at the sky and taking a picture like every minute. And then measuring the brightness of the stars in your image and constructing a time series looking for this tiny drop in brightness. And what we can do as well, though, is this artist conception on the top right. It's showing you a planet in front of the star, where the starlight is shining through the atmosphere and it's very fake. It's making it look glowing. But the point for you to take away is that when a planet goes in front of the star, some of the starlight shines through the atmosphere. And just like a flashlight shining through a fog, some light makes it through and some doesn't. And to make a very long story short, which would take me about quite a while to explain to you, we can measure the star by itself and then the star when the planet's in front of the star. And if we subtract those two, we can actually pick out the planet atmosphere imprinted on the starlight. So it would take me a while to explain it, but I just wanted you to get that very kind of brief snapshot, because most of my work is in exoplanets, and it's working hard to try to understand their atmospheres. So it's actually, hundreds, I'd say like a few hundred people work on this. So many, at least 200 or 300. And we use the Hubble Space Telescope today to study hot planet atmospheres. I don't know, something just went wrong with my slides, so give me a second here. I have to just exit my, so give me a second, back to where I was. So anyway, I was just telling you about exoplanets, and I was trying to explain to you how we study their atmospheres. And I was just about to tell you that we use the Hubble Space Telescope. I actually need you to enable screen sharing and make me a co-host again.
Oh, sorry, let me do that.
Sure. I was just about to tell you how we use the Hubble Space Telescope to study exoplanet atmospheres. And we have a special new telescope coming up. It's sometimes called the Next Generation Hubble Space Telescope. We also call it the James Webb. It's also actually officially called the James Webb Space Telescope. Okay, can you all see my screen now?
Yep.
Right, and so we have, today we study we can actually study exoplanet atmospheres, but we're limited to big hot planets. There's no way they can have life on them. They're not suitable for life in any way. But the good news is that we have another space telescope. It's called the James Webb Space Telescope that it was conceived of like literally 30 years ago, and it's supposed to launch next year. And this will enable us to study small rocky planet atmospheres. And if everything goes well, we'll have the capability to study gases in the atmosphere that, like oxygen on Earth, if they're there in huge quantities and they don't fit in with equilibrium chemistry, we may be able to associate them with life. So a while back, I came across this phrase from a special report about the search for life. And it says, nothing would be more tragic in the exploration of space than to encounter alien life and fail to recognize it. And I thought a lot about this because although it's true, our Earth has a lot of oxygen, 20% by volume. We only had that for 1 billion years. It may seem like a long time, but our Earth has been around for over 4.5 billion years. And so I started thinking about all the different gases life could produce. And just one weird thing I found was that if we think about our own Earth's atmosphere, every gas to the part per trillion level in Earth's atmosphere, except for the noble gases, is actually produced by life. Most of the gases have a dominant source that is not life-based. But I thought a lot about this, and I came up with a crazy theory of my own. Now, I was wondering how many of you have come up with a crazy theory and sent it to somebody, or I should really ask you first, how many of you have ever received a crazy theory on email? I honestly don't know if you have, but you can fill this poll out. It turns out if you are a graduate student or a professor at MIT in physics, I can't comment on most of the other fields. Like if you're a physics professor or grad student, you can receive as many as one theory a day from people. And these are typically like something about, they range from pretty much everything from like UFOs to modified gravity and other things like that. So it's a lot of theories. Okay, so most of you haven't. Actually, the climate scientists, they get the worst emails. They really do. Like, it's not even funny, but it's like on the level of death threats. Like people are so furious. Yeah. So in physics, at least we just get some crazy ones. So it looks like not too many, some people have received a crazy theory. Some have sent, okay, some have not. So I had my own crazy theory. And my theory was actually that life produced all gases. Because every gas I could think of, not being a chemist, and I gave you this one example of our atmosphere, seem to be made by life. Even ozone apparently is made inside some cells. So who does the MIT professor go to with the crazy theory? I kind of went to the next level up, a Nobel laureate. I had to go to Harvard though, which, yeah. So I went to this Nobel laureate at Harvard. He's a professor. Works in, the Nobel was in like the physiology or medicine. And he crushed the theory. He immediately came up with a counterexample, a small molecule that is not made by life and is in gas form. But so my two biochemistry friends and I who worked on this, we went back to the drawing board, and we're like a squirrel. You know how the squirrels are busy collecting nuts? Way too many, right? We just started doing this for no real reason other than it seemed like it might be interesting. And we created a giant database of all molecules that are in gas form at room temperature and pressure. And then we had an adjacent database curating something. It took a few years, actually, scraping websites. And you're not recording this or anything, but I had a Chinese student who could scrape some of the Chinese websites. They're all in Chinese. And yeah, and a lot of the websites here in the US, they don't want you scraping them because you're just supposed to query occasionally, so you have to put an automatic pause in so they don't get mad and kick you out. Because we curated a database of all products made by life, gases, liquids, solids. So we're able to find out that as for the molecules in gas form at room temperature and pressure, only about a quarter of them are made by life. That's neither here nor there, but now we have this jumping off point to consider any molecule that might be a biosignature gas, either here on Earth or on another planet. And one of my brilliant colleagues found out something even more interesting. I'm not going to dwell on it today, but it's sort of in the spirit of just trying new things. Found that there's some molecules or molecular fragments of molecules we call motifs that appear to be rarely or never made by life. And we're sort of following through each of these one by one to see where it takes us. Perhaps it could be useful in toxicity or even drug discovery. That's a whole other topic. In studying this, we also study molecules and classes of molecules as potential biosignature gases on another world. But to do that, it involves a lot of tools. We have to run simulations of planet atmospheres of different kinds. And we have to figure out if a gas could accumulate in the atmosphere. The biggest sink is photochemistry, where ultraviolet radiation from the star splits up molecules, creating radicals that then react away and basically destroy everything, all the gases being produced. So we do these really complicated things. But in both of those exercises, find something in the database that doesn't appear to be made by life or very rarely produced by life, and find an interesting gas that can accumulate in the atmosphere. In both of those categories, almost right away, one gas really stood out to us. And that gas is phosphine, which a lot of you probably haven't heard of. It's nothing that's really common here on Earth, actually, because on Earth, phosphorus, it wants to be with oxygen as phosphate. We don't have a lot of hydrogen here on Earth. So, and it just turns out the temperatures and pressures here, phosphine just doesn't want to form. Even if we had a lot of hydrogen, it just won't be here. So we started studying this gas phosphine, and we have a few papers. Some of them are review papers, just sort of making the case for phosphine as being produced by life. But when we first started working on this, we saw that there are some arguments against phosphine as being either made by life or as a useful biosignature. One of them was that there are no confirmed life-producing instances of phosphine. Another one was that phosphine is toxic and unstable, which is true. It was used as a chemical warfare agent in World War I, for example. But we actually found that there's counter-arguments to these, and that if there's life that's not in an oxidized environment, phosphine is fine for it. Some people took experiments of insects, a type of insect, made it dormant, like not dormant, and flooded it with phosphine, brought it back to life, and it was fine. And although we don't know which specific life form produces phosphine, it looks like it's a strain of E. coli. But people have measured phosphine out of oxygen-free environments like wetlands and sludges and animal guts. And there's even a paper about penguin colonies, penguin poop. Well, there's lots of phosphine over penguin colonies. Also, people have measured phosphine in the laboratory where they culture, a mixed culture of bacteria produces phosphine. So the evidence is pretty much a sure thing that phosphine is only associated with life on Earth, either us humans making it for some reason like a pesticide or bacteria, though we don't know the biochemical pathway yet. So now I'm going to move on to this discovery that a lot of you have heard of. If you don't, you'll hear a lot about it now. And the story gets even more interesting because this obscure gas as a biosignature, it turned out that it wasn't just my team, but another group across the pond, across the ocean, Professor Jane Greaves in the UK, actually decided to search for signs of life on Venus. I think Carl Sagan would have been proud of this because it's a pretty crazy idea. But what I am proud of Professor Jane Greaves for is she purposely searched through the literature, which isn't easy, trust me. Like, if you want to try to research a field not your own. And she came across the same papers we did on phosphine as a gas associated with life on Earth. And she proposed to use, when you want to use a telescope, this is a radio telescope called the James Clerk Maxwell telescope. It's in Mauna Kea, Hawaii at 14,000 feet. And you can see the picture in the middle. It's like a big radio telescope. She first proposed and the proposal team rejected it, which makes sense because it's kind of crazy to do. Second time around, it worked. She got a signal from the James Clerk Maxwell, and she was more surprised than anyone to find this signal. Meanwhile, because my team had been working on phosphine on exoplanets as a potential biosignature gas on exoplanets, a mutual contact connected our two teams. And our job was to help interpret what the phosphine detection could mean. Because like on Earth, Venus doesn't have oxygen, but it has a lot of carbon dioxide. There's almost no hydrogen. So again, phosphorus doesn't want to be with hydrogen, it needs to be with oxygen. So we helped Professor Jane Greaves propose to use a more powerful telescope called ALMA, Atacama Large Millimeter Array. And this is in Chile. It's actually like, I want to say it's at 17,000 feet. Has anyone even ever been that high? It's crazy. I've never been that high. I've only been to about, I'd say 14,000 feet, but yeah, it's high because water vapor is really contaminating for radio astronomy. You want to be like above the water vapor as far as possible. And this ALMA array has about 60 of these radio dishes all working together as an interferometer. So we got time on ALMA, and it's by the way, if you go, I don't know if anyone here is an early riser, and if you can wake up when it's still dark, you actually can see Venus in the morning sky. It's the brightest thing in the sky. If you just step outside first thing in the morning and look around and see, it's so bright. But this brightness is kind of ironically bad for astronomy because all of these telescopes, they're more designed to look at faint, far away things, point sources even, not a spatially resolved object. So it can be very challenging to observe a bright source, especially if you're looking for a tiny signal. So back to Venus for a moment, before I talk about the detection. Due to a massive greenhouse effect, Venus's surface temperature is way too hot for life. Like if we went to the surface, we wouldn't survive. It's a terrible place to live. But that hasn't stopped people from speculating for over half a century that there might be life in Venus. And what people are thinking about is it's not life on the surface, but it's life in the clouds. Because on Earth, if you hike up a mountain, you hear about or you see pictures of people on Mount Everest. It's really cold up there. It's because our temperature on our planet, it typically drops as you go away from the surface. And that's true on Venus as well. So away from the surface, up at about 50 kilometers above Venus's surface, the temperature is actually just right for life. And the pressure there as well, it matters less, but the pressure and temperature are just like we have right here on Earth, right in the room that you're in now. And so the thought is that there could be life living in the clouds of Venus. And that's kind of motivated by here on Earth, we have an aerial biosphere. There's life floating around in our atmosphere. It doesn't last very long, though. It gets swept up from the surface, and some of it will be inside droplets, some of it will be outside droplets. And after about a week, it comes back down. But our clouds on Earth, they come and go, right? Like they're not there forever, but Venus has a permanent cloud cover. And it has a very extensively deep cloud deck as well. It's always there. And so the thought is that there's some way that life can stay up in the clouds. All right, so back to ALMA. I'm going to show you the data that we published, or the plot we published. And the details aren't really so important for you. You can ask me questions later. Well, maybe I will explain it. So the sun hits Venus, some of it makes to the surface and heats the surface and the atmosphere. And in an atmosphere, no energy is created or destroyed. That energy has to eventually go back out. So we're looking at what we call thermal energy from the planet. So the sun heated the planet, and that energy has to come back out. But amidst all that energy coming out, the gases absorb some of the radiation. When I teach this to my undergrads, I say it's like the molecules take a bite out of the radiation. Imagine if you had a cookie and you take a bite out of it. So this radiation coming out should be normalized all at zero, but there's an absorption feature here. And this is like jargon for line to continuum ratio. We need a model to fit the data to infer how much phosphine there is. And the model that fits this data says there's about 20 parts per billion of phosphine, which is quite a small amount. And down here, instead of showing it to you in frequency or wavelength, the people who work on Venus, it's their convention, or work in radio astronomy, it's a convention to show it as Venus rest frame velocity. Because if you remember the Doppler shift from physics, 801, you can convert back and forth. So anyway, that's what we had. We actually have data from two telescopes, the James Clerk Maxwell telescope and the bigger ALMA telescope. And we saw this feature in both telescopes, which is really positive because, different telescopes, different types of noise, different everything really. And so the fact that it showed up in two of them, that was good. Yeah. I'm just going to give you one little technical detail for anyone who works in any near related field. And that is that this is a rotational feature. So molecules rotate and vibrate, but because of quantum mechanics, it's quantized. So it's not like a spinning top that you can kind of spin at any energy. It can only rotate at fixed energies. And these rotational lines, as they're called, they're quite spread out in the radio. So there's, within this image I'm showing you, there's very few other molecules in the Venus atmosphere that would have an overlapping feature because everything's all spread out. Now, there is one line that can overlap. It's a sulfur dioxide, SO2 line. But we had arguments as to why that line it would be too weak. It wouldn't show up at this level. All right, any questions so far? That's where we're at. Crazy to think about finding phosphine, even crazier to find a signal of it. So now I have some bad news, okay? Actually, I don't have the bad news yet. Okay, I'll come to the bad news later. So just to explain about phosphine, it turns out our solar system planets, Jupiter and Saturn, they actually have phosphine. But that's because they have, if you don't know about planetary science, you think of Jupiter and Saturn as being really cold. They're actually very warm because deep inside below the atmosphere, they're hot. And at those temperatures, with plenty of hydrogen, phosphine is the dominant form of phosphorus. So phosphine wants to form, and that phosphine can get convected up. So there's no problem. Jupiter and Saturn have phosphine. And so we worked really hard to try to find out why would Venus have phosphine in the atmosphere. There's so many ways people think it might have phosphine, but each one of these we worked through, we showed that it can't match even 20 parts per billion in the atmosphere. So Venus has active volcanoes, but they're not producing gases with hydrogen because Venus itself really doesn't have very much hydrogen. You'd need to create a scenario where volcanic activity was 200 times higher than what's measured on Earth, coupled with an unlikely water-rich mantle. You might argue surface minerals maybe get upswept, but again, we don't expect to have enough hydrogen-rich surface minerals because Venus is so oxidized. What about lightning? Lightning was kind of measured by a probe that went through Venus, but we've never seen it optically. We've never seen an image of it, not from Earth, but from an orbiter. You could have lightning, and you could argue that lightning might create phosphine, but it won't. It will fail to do so because there's just not the right materials in the atmosphere. And even if there were, we would need, the math just doesn't add up. Okay, one more idea, meteors. Here on Earth, tons and tons of particles and meteorite kind of fragments are hitting our Earth all the time. And one thought is that perhaps meteoritic delivery could deliver some phosphorus. But even, being generous in estimating the amount of material hitting Venus, it still falls short by many orders of magnitude. So what's really interesting is that no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't come up with any way to have phosphine on Venus. And so when we made this a big announcement, we said, we're not claiming we have found life on Venus. We're claiming we have found phosphine gas. And it's a mystery either way, because it's either some unknown chemistry no one has thought about yet, or very possibly it's life production. So in this case, there's a couple questions I'll answer. In this case, I actually talked about exoplanets, then I talked about Venus. And the type of spectroscopy we're doing is pointing a radio telescope at Venus. And that's what we call atmospheric spectroscopy. We're also working at infrared wavelengths, but we don't have any answers for you yet. How do we go about proving there's life on Venus? I'll come back to that. It may be impossible to truly prove it, but we'll get back to that. Yeah, so we don't know why there's phosphine on Venus. It makes no sense at all. And now for the bad news, is detection real? Well, in astronomy, because we're working on these big shared facilities, all our data is public. We want everyone. If you could work with radio astronomy data, I would encourage you to go and look at the data. And we started getting papers saying that there's no signal there. Now, even from the day one, we had for some reason, this was a very button pushing exercise, and our science colleagues just went crazy on us. Like, as soon as we announced it, this top scientist who ran a big mission that went to Saturn called Cassini immediately started plastering over public channels. Of course, it can't be life. We all know, phosphine is so common. Jupiter and Saturn have phosphine. Like I just explained to you why Jupiter and Saturn have phosphine. So any top planetary scientists should know, right? We had people, chemists would say, one of them, it was again, like in a public forum, and referring to one of the other colleagues on the team. Oh, I taught William, I tried to explain thermodynamics to William. And he didn't. He'd never talked with that subject on this call. I don't know why people got so upset. So one of these papers, it caused quite a stir on social media, because in the abstract, it basically claimed it ended the debate. There's no phosphine on Venus, and an unrefereed paper. So if you do research at MIT, you know that you write a paper, it goes to a journal, it gets refereed. You don't just blah, this is just wrong. So we have this one, not quite a Carl Sagan, but close. His name's David Grinspoon. He's a very good writer. He's kind of taken over being the proponent for life on Venus. And he wrote this really nice quote for us, just saying, it's so hard to find life. Let's support each other here. Let's not just be mean-spirited to each other. So the bad news is that because of all of this, the observatory, I actually have to explain one more step to you that's somewhat complex, but if you wanted to work with Hubble data or any data from a big facility, you could choose to work with the raw data, but most often you would work with what we call calibrated data. They make kind of very basic corrections by the experts who built the instrument, who know it really well. And even here at MIT, we run this exoplanet finding mission called TESS. We have to make all our data public. And honestly, no one uses the raw data. You all use the calibrated data. And just as a technicality, the calibrated data still has a lot of noise that you have to take away. You've got to remove noise from the data. So it's just one simple step. So ALMA went back to their data, and they found a bug in the way they calibrate it. Yeah. And they had to go back and fix it. So they've been doing that. They've been working on that. And this isn't the position I wanted to be. I didn't have to come and tell you, okay, sorry, phosphine's wrong. I'm not saying that. You got to wait and see. It's going to be a few more days before ALMA the observatory puts out their calibrated data, so we can all reanalyze it and see if the phosphine signal persists. So you're seeing firsthand how science is done. I don't want to be associated with something wrong, but I still have to take responsibility if something's wrong. So ALMA data is being recalibrated. Stay tuned. Meanwhile, something else happened. It's almost like a mystery novel. I really think it is, where all the people jumping on phosphine, now everybody wanted to write a paper. Everyone wants to do something. This really interesting scientist, his name's Rakesh Moghul. He's out at Cal Poly, and he went and looked at old data, archive data from Pioneer Venus. Pioneer Venus was a mission, an U.S. mission that went to Venus in the late 1970s, early 1980s, late 1970s. And it dropped off a probe in Venus. It was an orbiter, and it also dropped off a probe. And the funny part of this story is it's pretty crazy, but the data is archived, but not all the information they needed is actually. And they found this person who worked on Pioneer Venus, and he's like 90 years old. And he's got an incredibly good memory, and he's been working with the team, to help answer questions and figure things out. Like they had to figure out how many decimal places could they go to still. Like they had to refigure out how. Anyway, so this instrument is what's called a mass spectrometer, and it ionizes gases, sucks in gases from the atmosphere, ionizes them, subjects them to magnetic field, and they all have a slightly different path. And then the mass spectrometer can somehow assign a mass and charge to every fragment. And what you're seeing, you don't have to understand all this, but Rakesh is just labeling all the different fragments. So P, pH, pH2, pH3, those would all come from phosphine. So some of the phosphine overlaps with other stuff. pH3 overlaps with H2S. But if you look here at P, this phosphorus ion, it's unique. There's nothing else that can really come close to it. So this Pioneer Venus definitively has found this phosphorus ion. And in his paper, he works through arguments as to why it has to be phosphine. Because there's no other gas. There's no other gas containing phosphorus at the altitude where this probe has sampled that he's showing you. Now, there's a tiny chance it could be, he explains why it can't be. There could be liquid acids that have phosphorus, but there's no, and some of the vapor associated with the acid might have got sucked into the machine, but there's no parent fragments from those acids detected in this thing. So it's kind of mysterious. It would be a crazy world if the team I'm part of mistakenly found phosphine from an artifact that may have been introduced by calibration, only to find that it was there with Pioneer Venus. So we have to let this unfold. It's not the talk I had signed up to give you, but obviously it's my job to be honest, and you get to see how this kind of crazy thing's done. Okay, what's the timeline for the results? Well, we've been working on it already, and we got advanced. So if you're the team that proposes, you usually get proprietary time with the data, like a year. And the ALMA Observatory was nice enough to give us the data first before it goes public. So it's supposed to go public any day. It was supposed to go public earlier this week. So we're trying to finish up our analysis to put it on our field's archive, public archive. And this should be early next week sometime. So meanwhile, one of those rebuttal papers also looked at the second telescope, or the first telescope we used, JCMT, and they still saw a weak signal there. All right. Yeah, it's like a mystery novel instead of a science project. So I have a few more things to say, and then we can go to a Q&A. So either way, whether or not phosphine is there, we are still going to Venus. We have somehow like galvanized the community. Now, if we were politicians, if I was a politician, you could accuse me of doing this on purpose even. But we sort of moved Venus back into the limelight here. It always reminded me of like I don't know if this happens in your family, but there's always a sibling who's ignored. If you have a sibling, you've one or two siblings, one of them is always ignored. That's like Venus, because Mars gets all the attention. So here at MIT, I'm actually leading a study. It's not a mission that's paid for, but it's a concept study. And we've been studying 3 missions, small, medium, and large. Small is would be a short-term fast mission. Medium would be a longer-term mission. And large would be a slower mission that would take longer. We have a small mission. Any space buffs out there, you'll have read that Rocket Lab, which is a American and New Zealand company, they launch small rockets, not big rockets, actually. They're launching really small rockets with specialized sets of payloads. And the CEO of that, his name's Peter Beck, he's apparently wanted to go to Venus since he was a child, you know? Kids love dinosaurs and like asteroids maybe, but it's kind of weird. But yeah, he actually has money, like he's already raised private money to pay for one of his rockets to go to Venus. So we've partnered with Rocket Lab to help figure out what our instrument would be. Now, this is a pretty small mission, and the payload itself, so what's left after the rocket can get to Venus, would be about 15 kilograms. It's like about 30 pounds. It's not very much, because once you think about the batteries and the radio and the shell and this and that and the other, for your instrument, you're only left with about 3 kilograms, which for space missions is basically almost nothing. So we're working to figure out what we'd like to see, and that would be gases, not just phosphine, but methane and other gases that would signal a disequilibrium that might indicate life. Our medium mission is inspired by Russia had 2 balloons that went to Venus. And on the bottom right, it's a picture from a museum. This is, I think, a scale model, but the balloon was a few meters across. And dropping down below it is a so-called gondola, like an instrument suite. And this balloon lasted for a couple of days, actually. I think until its batteries ran out. And it was able to transmit information, I think, back to Earth. So there's our little cartoon thing there. Yeah. So we're studying how to go to Venus, how to search for signs of life and life itself. So to the question that was asked about how will you find life, it's really hard. In an ideal world, we would honestly send a microscope as part of our payload and suck in the droplets, concentrate the life. I can see people smiling and look for stuff swimming around. But we can't really do that. We found that the spatial resolution of microscopes that exist that can go to space and work in space, they're not good enough to do that, actually. Plus, there's a lot of what we would call confounding material. There's a lot of droplets themselves that might look like cells. So we probably would still take a microscope. There's ones that have laser. You can get lasers that fluoresce the material. So if you shine a laser at little particles, they'll light up, they'll respond in different ways, whether it's organic material or life or other things. And we would need to have like experiments here on Earth to try to interpret whatever we find there. Because from all the past missions in the 80s, we have a good sense of the particle sizes and compositions that are not life related. The second thing we do is have a mass spectrometer, not just for gas, but for solids and liquids. And we're starting a series of experiments here on Earth to see what kind of materials will survive, what kind of like life signaling materials actually survive in sulfuric acid. Because I forgot to mention, this is really important, the droplets are nasty, nasty material. Okay, so I'm just going to walk you through one more thing really quickly, because motivated by all this, I actually, I'm not going to show you that. I'm just going to tell you one more thing. This is the one thing that I myself personally worked on. So I just felt like I wanted to try it out on you. The question so when people work on signs of life on Venus, I don't know if this is going to surprise you, but it hasn't been too quantitative. So at MIT, we're like numbers, math, engineering, like a lot of the stuff, it's very hand wavy. So in the last couple of years, it was actually my team, because of this phosphine result we were going to put out, they actually pushed me to like try to help make this a bit more quantitative, because the problem is life has to stay in the clouds. And we think it has to live inside droplets because it's just so dry outside of these droplets. It's way drier than the most driest place on Earth. And all life needs some kind of liquid, whether that's water or sulfuric acid or whatever, and just don't think it could manage. But the problem is that the droplets grow, they stick together after a while. And by the way, they don't bounce off each other. The conditions for fragmentation are not there. So it's inevitable that as the particles with life in it, the little cloud droplets, they start growing. And eventually gravity is going to make them drop down out of the atmosphere. And this isn't really that important here, but it's showing you altitude in kilometers above the Venus surface. And this is particle size. And the color bar shows you timescales, how long it takes a particle to settle out. So the tiniest particles, you could just think about that in your head for a second. They're so small, they can just stay aloft. The bigger, heavier ones start dropping out. And so this sort of shows you timescales that different particles would live. Anyway, the paper is more detailed about timescales for growing and surviving and everything. So what I did was I came out with a theory. I hope this isn't like as crazy. This isn't necessarily a crazy theory. And for some reason, the people in the Venus community really like this quantitative theory. So I came up with this, what I call life cycle. This is a cartoon image of Venus showing you the surface, which is very hot. There's a temperature here scale on the right. And as I mentioned, up in the atmosphere, it gets cooler and cooler. And this is just a pressure scale, which is less important. So there's all these clouds in the Venus atmosphere, but beneath the clouds, there's a very mysterious layer of lower haze. And actually, people don't know what it is, actually. It's just very stable. It's a stagnant layer. It's just kind of there. And so in my theory, I called it the depot. I called this lower haze layer a depot for life, like a parking place for life. And the idea is that some dried out spores could populate that layer. And here's a zoom in of that circular area. So just go with me through these numbers here. So 1, these are the so-called desiccated spores. they actually get to be updrafted eventually, where they can form like a cloud condensation nuclei, a particle that can collect liquid. And once that life becomes encased in liquid, it can now germinate and become metabolically active again. In 4, it's showing you a cartoon of imagining these metabolically active microbes that can grow and divide. And they just sort of float around in the atmosphere, getting moved by winds and such. They collide with other droplets, they grow. But eventually, after timescales of about months or years, the droplet gets big, like shown here in number 5, and eventually has to settle back out. In this theory, it's eventually it goes down, and then the liquid evaporates because it gets really hot. And just like some life forms on Earth, when they get in really hot, dry conditions, they sporulate. They actually turn into a spore. And the idea is that these spores would be left without their protective droplet, but they're also a lot lighter. And now they can remain suspended in this layer until they can get updrafted again. It's not a perfect theory. How they get from a very stagnant layer back up, there's no convection in that layer, there's no winds moving up. It's really hard, but there's a crazy thing on Venus that there appear to be these gravity waves from wind blowing over mountains. It creates a wave. Think of like a wave on the ocean. It doesn't move things, but it kind of mixes. It kind of can compress and uncompress like certain areas. So the idea is that it can kind of move things along slowly, but it's definitely a weak point in the theory. All right, so to summarize, I was just started out by this crazy idea how we were searching through all molecules, and we hit upon phosphine as an interesting gas to study. On Earth, although it initially appears life doesn't make it, it actually is associated with life in oxygen-free environments. Because it doesn't want to form, there's no hydrogen, the temperatures and pressures are wrong for phosphine. It pretty much looks like that there's no other way to make it other than life. So we got involved with this search for phosphine on Venus because very few other astronomers were working on this. And whether or not phosphine's there is still now under debate. But Venus is the new frontier because this new discovery has renewed interest in going back to Venus and to looking for signs of life, or maybe even some way life itself in the Venus atmosphere. And that concludes my talk. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Seager. I think now we'll open it up to questions. People, big round of applause.
And you can use your reaction, like that. It's kind of awkward doing this one, but yeah.
People can use the raise hand function or send messages in the chat.
Please post in the chat if you have a question or if you'd like to be, if you'd like to ask a question.
We can start with Rahi. Rahi, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just being unmuted. Thanks for the talk. It's very fascinating. What has this whole episode with phosphine on Venus taught you about exoplanets and searching for life on them?
Well, it's taught me something very maybe obvious, but crushingly negative, because it's that if you're looking for a really tough signal to find and you have to really, really, for lack of a better word, massage your data, it's so hard to find anything. And the fact that even if it is a real signal on Venus, no one believes it could ever be made by life, even though we carefully have demonstrated that there's no known chemical pathway. People, I'm not saying there is life there, but the fact that people are so reluctant to entertain that idea, I think it's going to be even harder for exoplanets because they're far away. They're that pale blue dot we saw in the intro. And, we can say, hey, we know it's in the Venus atmosphere because we've sent probes there. We know a little bit about the surface, because we've had landers and we've had orbiters study the surface. But on these exoplanets, we're not going to know anything about the surface. We're not going to know that it really is what we call oxidized, more oxygenated than, having hydrogen. So I think it taught me it's going to be way harder than I ever imagined to have any, not even conclusive, but any strong evidence for life elsewhere based on gases.
Yeah. Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure. Yes.
So what do you think it would take to, like, what kind of technology would we need for you yourself to be confident that you could have a result like that? And that
we could have a gas detection that people would argue over, you mean? Or like we'd have enough resolution to be very confident that we've discovered life. Yeah. So actually teach a class on exoplanets, and we derive all the equations and we look at data. And oddly enough, that's exactly what I talked about today. And the students actually didn't like it, but I'm going to answer that question two ways. The exoplanets, they're always going to be a point source to us, or we don't see them at all. They just go in front of the star as seen from the telescope. So when we talk about resolution, it's what we call spectral resolution. It's how fine of a wavelength can we get? How robust can we see a line, a drop? We'll never get spatial resolution within the paradigm we live in, because we would need 50 telescopes in space, each of them being 50 meters in diameter, all operating together, if we want to spatially resolve the planet. So is that what you were asking about, how that spatial resolution, or?
It was more so, there are people arguing over phosphine on Venus, and just like this general sense of we got to rule everything else out, right? Yeah. I'm just wondering, can we get to a point where we can look at exoplanets and have a really strong case that that we've ruled everything else out, and that,
like, if we can't do that for Venus, then we can't do it for an exoplanet, because Venus is right beside us, and it's very bright, so it's going to be really tough.
So I guess what I'm asking is there future technology that we could have here on Earth that would do that for Venus?
Well, for Venus, we could go to Venus.
Right.
And we can measure gases right in the atmosphere itself. We can, have a microscope and fluoresce things. We can analyze the organic compounds that are there. So we can do all of that to help bolster it. And there are big missions planned for Venus. None of them ever get selected by NASA and funded. But there's crazy stuff people are thinking about that would measure everything from the top of the atmosphere through the atmosphere to the surface. And so we could have like a set of theories, right? And rule them out. So we could say, Venus, maybe phosphine does come from volcanoes. Well, we could rule those things out by measuring them very carefully. But so for exoplanets, we won't be able to do any of that. And our information will always be really limited.
Thanks.
All right, next question. Colleen, would you please unmute yourself and proceed?
Thank you. Thank you for this talk. It's really fascinating. I'm wondering, what you expect life on Venus to look like. Is it going to be carbon-based, and will they use nucleic acids like we see here on Earth, or is there something else that you're expecting to find?
We don't have a lot of preconceived expectations. We do know that at least DNA itself and most proteins, they don't survive in sulfuric acid.
Right.
So that's a problem. It could be that, so people like to think of all options. It could be that life has some kind of protective shell made out of lipids or hydrocarbons. Or sulfur. There are some things that do survive in sulfuric acid. So it really could go one way or the other. We don't know if it would be carbon-based, probably, but don't know about that. Yeah, so we really don't know. We just know sulfuric acid is really destructive for our life here on Earth, actually. It's bad.
As a follow-up, then, do you know what pH you would expect the atmosphere to be?
Well, the atmosphere itself is probably more of a neutral pH, but the sulfuric acid itself is almost off the charts in terms of acidic pH. Yeah. We are trying to come up with some ground-based experiments, though, to answer your question more specifically. So if you were to get back in touch with me in 6 months, I might be able to have a slightly better answer for you.
That's exciting. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, next question. Jason, would you please unmute yourself and proceed?
Sure. I was wondering, with this giant catalog of molecules and how they're produced, what are the other most interesting biosignatures or potential biosignatures?
Let's see. Well, it sounds really bad, but I still think oxygen is the best one. It's very Terra-centric, but very Earth-focused. But oxygen, it's so hard to it just shouldn't be there. It's so reactive. There's really no good way to make oxygen. So I really like oxygen. We've looked at so many gases like ammonia and isoprene, and there's some gases called halocarbons like methyl chloride. So there's a lot of ones to choose from, but most of them, at least on Earth, they're made in such tiny amounts. It's hard to imagine that life elsewhere, for whatever reason, pumps out tons of a gas that is quite obscure. But I don't really know. I watched this really funny video today. There's this professor in Scotland. I can put the link in the chat if you're interested. And for his last class of the year, he actually dresses up like an alien. And he pretends to be from another planet that has discovered Earth. But they don't call it Earth, they call it Naknar 5 or something. And he kind of goes through the arguments to his class. He's pretending to be a professor in this alien world. And he's telling the class, like, there's no possible way there could be life on this planet we've discovered. He's like, oxygen is so combustible. It's just no life could ever survive. So we're so limited in our thinking. Like, I'll say I love oxygen, but we're just going to wait and see, in the next, with the James Webb Space Telescope and others to follow, we'll have our first chance to see what's out there. So I think we have to wait and see what's there rather than, pick all the best ones. I mean, we're trying to be ready to identify what's there rather than have some false confidence that one is really better than the other.
So on the opposite side, if this phosphine is from some other unknown chemical mechanism, how much can we use our knowledge of Venus to narrow the search for the space of these possible mechanisms? And is that useful for, I guess, inspiring chemistry and chemical engineering to think through new design spaces?
It's possible. Mm-hmm. Let me think. Like, what people worry about in chemistry is we can all work out chemical equilibrium. But if you have kinetics, like molecules bumping into each other, like the speed or the likelihood of the reaction is something that's sometimes very non-intuitive. So it's possible that we could come up with a specific list and give to them. Yeah. One of the things people
David?
worry about is,
sorry.
no, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to call the next person because I thought you were done, but.
No, I'm done. You can go on.
Okay. David, you had a question?
Thank you, Dr. Seager. I was wondering, you mentioned that in order to measure the signal of phosphine on another planet, you need to have a model of the other planet's atmosphere and the rate at which these gases degrade, so you can see what would be an unexpected amount of this gas that could be due to life pumping out some this gas by some mechanism. So how do you constrain those models, and what data do you need from like an exoplanet or something to do that?
Okay, well, I can answer the question for, I guess, exoplanets first, then maybe for Venus. Let me think. So right now we do get data from the Hubble Space Telescope, but not for small rocky planets, which are out of our reach, just for giant planets. And we don't get very much of the spectrum. It's just like maybe 1 or 2 microns, and there's water vapor and maybe some other stuff there. So we just kind of do, okay, a simple way to think about it is like a million model approach. I could just generate all the models I could, million model, and see which ones fit the data. And then I can kind of constrain what's there. But people use more clever techniques like Bayesian techniques or other techniques to kind of narrow down the parameter space. So we do try to fit the data and let the data tell us how much of which gas is present. But it's somewhat rough right now because the data is not very good. So that's the answer for there. You'd think we could do a better job for Venus. And we can use models to fit the data to tell you how much phosphine is there if that plot I showed you is real. But we also struggle with photochemistry models because we don't know the distribution of the radicals, the gases that are really going to create destruction for phosphine and others. So there's a lot of unknowns there. And I think we do have to design, it sounds greedy, but we do have to design an experiment carefully to go there. And what do we want to measure as a function of altitude?
All right, we have a question from Andy. Any hopes for future collaboration with international partners in space exploration?
Yes, on my Venus team now, at least at the concept study level, we do. We're actually working with a group from India, and so that's interesting. But it's quite hard to work with people. Like if we can make an instrument that would go on an international, like a European or another country's mission, that's good. Or if they want to give us an instrument on our, but it's very hard to work together. It's just the distance, the culture. And there's some countries it's very hard for us to work with at all, like China, where we have some parts of space satellites are considered weapons. And like we're not allowed to obviously share weaponry with other countries. So there's some things that makes it really hard, even as a professor, to do hardware projects with people from other countries. It's really challenging, I'd say. Even this rocket lab I was telling you about from New Zealand, they're actually an American company as well as being a New Zealand company. And a lot of the small commercial spaceflight companies that want to sell you like a satellite to put your instrument in, they all have US offices to make it easier to work with them. So I'd say there are possibilities, but it's always pretty hard.
We have a question from Diego. What would you think, according to the full development of life in our solar system, could we be living the initial stage of life in our neighboring planets, or is it just a mere chance?
Can you explain that? I wonder if Diego could just get on and ask that question a little more specifically.
Diego?
Not sure quite what it means, yeah.
Diego, you there? Can you unmute?
And could we be living the initial stage of life? Could we be seeing the initial stage of life? I'm not sure what he means exactly.
I don't have I can't get a response. I don't know.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, then next question is from Rahi. Rahi, do you want to unmute?
Sure. You talked a little earlier about Starshade, and full disclosure, I've done research on you as well. Can you talk a little bit about Starshade and talk about where it will take us in exoplanet hunting?
Sure, I can. Yes. Let me just pull up a slide here to explain everyone what it was. Well, I mean, there's a lot going on in exoplanets. It's a huge field full of a lot of things that are happening. And it's actually one of my favorite projects is what's called Starshade. So I just have a couple of slides to explain it to you. The most planets we have today, they're transiting. They go in front of the star as seen from the telescope. And these ones are the easiest ones for us to study at the moment, but they're limited because you have to have planets that go like right in front of the star as seen from you. In an ideal world, we could see all the planets around a star. And the goal would be to block out the starlight so we can see the planets directly. And you can imagine setting up a giant screen and put it in outer space. But the problem with putting a giant screen out, if we imagine putting a giant circular screen, you want to ask, can you block out a star that's a point source? And the answer is no, actually. You'd block out the star, but you would get this pattern on the right here. This is actually on a logarithmic scale, so you can actually see these rings. It's an airy ring pattern. I think like at least half of you should remember this from physics, either 801 or high school or something, but it's diffraction. The light can act like a wave and it can bend around the edges of a giant screen. Just like throwing a pebble in a pond, there's ripples, and these light ripples, they're way brighter than the planet you're looking for. So back in the 1960s, it wasn't Carl Sagan, unfortunately, but it was an astronomer by the name of Spitzer, Lyman Spitzer. he actually conceived of something we now call Starshade. And Starshade is a very specially shaped giant screen. It's like this one conception would be like the shape shown on the bottom left here. And by blocking out the starlight, the light still diffracts around the edges. But from this mathematically designed shield, the light can be completely blocked out. This would be like you dropping a pebble in a pond, and instead of seeing ripples, the pond would be perfectly smooth. And all the ripples would be pushed to the outer edges. Now, every decade, Starshade was revisited, it turned out. Remember I was saying that what is crazy in mainstream is constantly shifting? And it was still crazy until about 10 years ago, when I got to lead the study. Here's an animation showing you Starshade and a telescope could launch together, and the petals would unfurl from a stowed position. This whole thing would be tens of meters in diameter. That's like 100 feet. And it would have to formation fly tens of thousands of kilometers from the telescope. In this instance, it's going to line up perfectly to block out the starlight. And there happens to be a Jupiter and Earth in this artist's conception. I mean, there's a lot I didn't tell you, but the Starshade has to be extremely well made, like very precise, because to block out the starlight, like the sun or the star is so much brighter than the Earth that it has to be pretty crazily done. There's a petal prototype. That's myself and 2 team members out at JPL, a NASA center out in Pasadena, California. Look how the tip goes way out there. This particular petal, it just shows you how big it is, right? It's like 7 meters long. If you look carefully, you can see these bright white dots. This thing was put on a table with a laser metrology system, and the laser went zip, 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 like for an hour all around to measure the distances between those points so that overall the team could figure out if the Starshade petal was made to the tolerances that it needs to be. So in order to block out that starlight so perfectly, you'd have to prescribe this shape to about, let's say, I think it's about 100 microns. But the question is, like, how do you measure that? You've designed it to your, how do you measure that you've actually built it to what you designed? So that's why this was an early petal that was made. Here's this is actually a beauty shot. It's kind of a beauty shot. That's David. He's one of the engineers at JPL, showing you some small scale models of Starshade. They call it membrane management, how it will fold up and deploy. But Starshade would be a major game changer. It's really the best chance we have to find a planet like Earth. And you know what we would literally see? It's like what the movie at the introduction was based on, the pale blue dot. We'd see like a point of light that's a pale blue dot if we can block out that starlight and see the planet directly. So it was kind of a long answer to your question about Starshade.
Yeah, that was great. So is this conceptual? I mean, I see prototypes and things like that, but is it a mission that's set to go out, or is there still work to be done before that's happens?
What happens in this field is that there's just limited money, because astronomy, it's kind of a luxury science. And so there's some budget, but we're all competing for the same budget. So if you had a different speaker tonight, she or he might have a different, equally crazy project that is the same extreme expense. So right now, Starshade gets money for technology development. And we're ready to go if we get a go-ahead. And what happens is somewhat unique, but in astronomy, because we all have these giant shared facilities like Hubble, like ALMA, the community gets together every decade in what's called a Decadal Survey. Not a very imaginative name, Decadal Survey. It's supposed to be objective, but it's really tough. And this committee is supposed to listen to the whole community and actually make a rank-ordered list of the most important missions in order. And then that's how we get our big missions, is everyone agrees on it. Like the James Webb Space Telescope, it's way over budget. It was supposed to be $2 billion. It's like $10 billion. The reason why it never got cut was because every year it was put number one, even when it was in trouble. So Starshade, and we made, to get ready for the Decadal, we had every option, like the smallest, cheapest one out to like a big, expensive one. And so we're all waiting for the Decadal Survey to bless, to give us a ranking that's hopefully really high up. But it's not clear where things will go because, it's sort of a time for austerity. And this James Webb Space Telescope, it really has to launch successfully with all that money put into it. And so we're kind of waiting for that to work. And if that's like Hubble again, everyone will love it. And then we'll be in the good again. Maybe we can get more money then. So I'm not sure when it can become a real project. Hopefully soon, but it might have to wait another decade.
Wow. That's so cool.
So we have a question from Andy again. The question is, you're looking outward. What about life signs in the ocean floors or sea vents of volcanic gases?
I just got to be on a panel with someone who works just on that. And this person, she's been able to go down in Alvin, you know, that there's this little, it's so scary, I think, down to the seafloor, and found a whole bunch of really weird, interesting stuff. So I don't work on that myself, but there's still a lot to, apparently there's still a lot to discover down there as well.
And we had another question from David.
Yeah, thank you again, Professor. I'm wondering, in your quantitative model of the atmosphere and how life could live in this sort of suspended plane in the atmosphere of Venus, does that constrain life on Venus to unicellular or very small number oligocellular life forms? And if that's the case, I'm wondering, thinking about this idea of the great filter, of at what point does life become very difficult to, make the next great leap in sophistication, whether it's from, nothing to unicellular to multicellular to, animated life and sentience in a civilization. Does that kind of constrainment mean that this great filter is sort of in between us and between multicellular life and unicellular life? I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think in Venus, okay, so I didn't quite cover, it's a terrible place for life, actually. If life can survive, it's very nutrient limited. It's not just acidic, but it's hard to imagine that anything complex could exist, that it has the energy and all it needs. So yes, in my quantitative theory, it's not as quantitative as you might like. It's just more quantitative than what's mostly in that field. It has to be just single-celled life, some kind of single-celled life. Yeah. So we probably have to wrap up soon, but I thought I'd launch this poll after this talk just for fun and see where everyone falls on this thought now. I can see the numbers coming in and I'll be able to share it with you in a moment. It's actually really funny. You're going to like this. Okay, I'll share it now. It's not what I expected. Do you see that? Well, maybe we move some people from no to the maybe category, but it's overwhelmingly maybe, actually, which is good. But maybe before today, it was overwhelmingly no. So at least you can now have an informed maybe.
Thank you so much, Professor Seager. That was an incredible talk, and it was really great to have you.
Thank you so much. It was nice meeting all of you and to learn about your club.